Sometimes the story behind a famous poem is even wilder than the poem itself. Today, we're going to dive into one of the most famous poems in the English language and uncover this strange, surprising story of where its words really came from. It's a tale of translation, ambition, and a secret identity that's been hiding in plain sight for over a century.
I bet you've heard this verse before, right? It's intense, it's romantic, a little bit rebellious. These lines, they're credited to the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and they pop up everywhere, from famous courtrooms to modern manifestos. They feel so timeless, like they could have been written yesterday.
And that brings us to the big mystery. Now, if you said the 11th century Persian poet Omar Khayyam, you're on the right track, but you're definitely not getting the whole picture. So, what if I told you that the person who wrote those exact words couldn't read a single line of Persian?
Okay, so to really get what's going on here, we have to start with the man who made the Rubaiyat a massive sensation in the West, Edward Fitzgerald. See, his version wasn't just some dry, academic translation. It was a literary event. It created a whole phenomenon.
And I'm not exaggerating. After Fitzgerald published his version, and especially after he died, a full-on cult of the Rubaiyat took over England and America. People started Omar Khayyam clubs. The book became this cultural touchstone for a whole generation that was wrestling with big ideas about faith and science and the meaning of it all.
And here's the most important part. Fitzgerald's creative genius was so huge that he basically eclipsed the original poet. People felt like they were reading a brand new, original English poem by Fitzgerald. He didn't just translate the Rubaiyat. In the minds of many, he was the Rubaiyat. He set an incredibly high bar.
All right, so with that scene set, in walks our main character. Enter Richard Le Gallienne, a poet who, right at the peak of this Rubaiyat craze, decides he's going to make his own version. And, well, he had a very interesting and surprisingly honest way of going about it.
Le Gallienne was super specific. He didn't call his work a translation. Nope. He called it a paraphrase. He wasn't even pretending to be some scholar hunched over ancient manuscripts. He was openly admitting, hey, I'm just rewording something that other people have already written. And this is where you just have to admire his nerve. In the introduction to his own Rubaiyat, he basically jokes that knowing Persian would get you kicked out of the real Omar Khayyam fan club. I mean, he's flat out admitting he can't read the original poem, and he's spinning it as a badge of honor. So you have to ask, why? Why do this? Why create a new version of a famous poem you can't even read? Well, you can't really separate what Le Gallienne was doing from the business of publishing. The Rubaiyat was a certified bestseller, tapping right into this Western fascination with the so-called mystical East, and there was a huge market for more. And Le Gallienne had this absolutely brilliant metaphor to justify it all. He said Fitzgerald wasn't a translator. He was an English magician who took the original petals of Omar's poem and made them bloom into a magnificent purple rose. So, Le Gallienne saw himself as just picking up the leftover petals to create his own little yellow rose. Pretty clever, right? So his method was pretty straightforward. He took a bunch of existing literal translations, the ones made by actual scholars, and then in his own words, he manipulated them. He added his own poetic style, his own creative choices, and then published this new poem, all while using the world-famous brand name of Omar Khayyam.
Now, while Le Gallienne was pretty upfront about his process, what he did fits perfectly into this fascinating academic idea called pseudo-translation. It's basically when an author writes an original work, but presents it as a translation of some famous, often exotic foreign writer. It's a way to use their fame and maybe some Orientalist stereotypes to get a leg up the literary ladder.
Okay, check this out. This is where you can really see his method in action. On the left, you have a literal scholarly translation. It's pretty direct. It compares hypocrites to a donkey, an ass. But now look at what Le Gallienne does on the right. He completely throws out the original simile and instead creates this fiery, in-your-face insult, a maggot-minded, starved, fanatic crew. That's not translation. That's a total reinvention.
So what happened? How did the world react to Le Gallienne's little yellow rose? Well, at first, it was completely buried in the shadow of Fitzgerald's giant purple one. The critics were not impressed.
Oof. This New York Times review from back then pretty much sums it up. He was being judged against the master, Fitzgerald, and he just didn't measure up. The review was brutal, calling his work feeble and commonplace.
You'd think his version was destined to be forgotten completely.
So just to recap, you've got these two key players, Fitzgerald, the pioneer, the English magician who basically became the author in the public's imagination. And then you have Le Gallienne, the self-described paraphraser, the poet whose work got trashed by critics and whose name was pretty much lost to time, even when his words weren't.
But, and this is the most incredible part of the whole story, here's the twist. Despite what the critics said, Le Gallienne's version was a massive popular success, second only to Fitzgerald's. And more importantly, his lines are often the ones that have stuck around. Remember that famous verse we started with? The one about no heaven but here? Yeah, that was written by Richard Le Gallienne, the guy who couldn't read Persian. It was quoted by the legendary lawyer Clarence Darrow and the famous author Christopher Hitchens, all of them thinking they were quoting a Marcaio.
So this whole strange case leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it? When a poem travels like this across hundreds of years and entire cultures, what does authorship even mean? Is the true author the original creator back in 11th century Persia? Is it the magician who turned it into a global phenomenon? Or is it the uncredited poet whose words, against all odds, are the ones that actually echo in our minds today?